16, right? Yay. Yeah. Okay. So we know that the spinal cord is continuous with the medulla, correct? Yes, it is. Okay, so this diagram actually is really for the meninges, and the meninges around the spinal cord are basically the same as around the brain, but we only have one layer of dura mater around the spinal cord, right? Instead of having the 2 layers like we do around the brain. So I think some of you have already looked at this model. Some of you may be kind of familiar with it. This shows the spinal cord, but it also shows the meninges, and it shows the spaces around the meninges. Okay, so it looks like this, except this is better, I think. It's easier to see this. And so you can see the 3 layers of the meninges. Now remember that around the spinal cord, we have an epidural space that's an actual space, where around the brain, the epidural space is a potential space, right? So where you see the fat and the blood vessels here, that is the epidural space. Now notice that right up against the bone of the vertebra here, there's this gray layer. That is a ligament, so just ignore that, okay? And so, let's take a look here. And this also shows you the 3 layers, but here you can't really see the spaces around them. Okay, so this also describes the meninges and what's in the spaces. So notice that, like the subdural space around the brain, the subdural space is a potential space around the spinal cord. And also, like around the brain, cerebrospinal fluid is in the subarachnoid space. So other than that one, the one difference with the dura mater, the meninges are exactly the same around the spinal cord. Okay, so let's go on to look at this longitudinal view of the cord. And this looks like this model here, this gigantic thing. Okay, so this shows basically the same stuff we're going to talk about now. Okay, this thing is heavy. Okay. Okay, so the spinal cord travels all the way down through the spinal canal, through the, the vertebral foramen of each vertebra. And you would think that the spinal cord would be as long as the spine, but actually it is not. It ends at about L1, L2. Okay, so roughly L1, L2 level of our vertebrae is where the spinal cord ends. This is because the spine grows more quickly than the spinal cord. So the cord ends up being shorter than the spine is. And you can see where we have all of these spinal nerves exiting from the spinal cord. They travel out through those intervertebral foramina between the vertebrae, and we'll come back and talk about the spinal nerves later. Notice here though, below the level of the spinal cord, we still have spinal nerves that are coming off the spinal cord. They're traveling down through the rest of the vertebral canal, and some of them even travel down into the sacral canal. Okay, so this ending of the spinal cord that you see here, okay, that cone-shaped ending of the cord, if you were to kind of take a look at that up close, you can see it's kind of a cone-shaped ending. That is called the conus medullaris. This is a large spinal cord. It's actually very narrow. But that is called the conus medullaris. You can also say medullary cone. You can call it either one. Okay, so named after its shape. And also you can see, again, all these spinal nerves traveling off of the end of the cord here. So this just kind of shows some of those spinal nerves. These would come down through the vertebral canal, some of them down into the sacrum. All of these nerves together supposedly resemble a horse's tail. So this is called the cauda, I know it's hard to see, cauda equina. which means horse's tail. Okay, cauda equina. And then one more structure here that I'd like you to know. And if you look closely at this, notice you see this little green piece of tissue here coming from the end of the cord. This comes all the way down to the coccyx. You guys remember the coccyx, right? So there's your coccyx. So this piece of tissue comes all the way down and attaches to the coccyx. So let's draw that, and our coccyx would be down here. This is actually the pia mater, traveling off the end of the spinal cord and kind of attaching itself here to the coccyx. This helps to kind of hold the cord in place. You guys remember the pia mater is actually fused to the spinal cord just like it's fused to the brain. Okay, but in this area here, it has a special name. It's called the phylum terminale. Okay, phylum terminale, but it is a piece of the pia mater coming off the bottom of the cord and attaching to the coccyx. So, although these three structures do not look alike, I think because they're in the same area, people get these mixed up all the time. So I think it's a good thing to draw this just to, and label it yourself, just to kind of get all these different parts straight so you don't get them mixed up. And remember that the conus medullaris is actually named after its shape, right? The cone-shaped ending, the cauda equina, named after, again, its appearance, looks like a horse's tail. So if you just think about the names, then you'll know what they are. Okay, so a couple of other things that you can see here in this longitudinal view, and these are very subtle. So I'm just gonna kind of exaggerate these a little bit. In the lower cervical region, there's a little bit of a bulge in the cord where the diameter is a little bit larger. This is called the cervical enlargement. Okay, cervical enlargement. This is where nerves exit the spinal cord that will go out to the upper extremity. Okay, so nerves exit to the upper extremity, and it makes that part of the cord a little bit bigger. You guys know NN is nerves, right? It's the abbreviation for nerves. Okay, then down in the lower part of the cord, kind of just above that conus medullaris, right in here, another kind of slight enlargement. This is called the lumbosacral, or just lumbar is okay. Lumbar or lumbosacral enlargement. And this is where nerves exit to the lower extremity. Okay, so the area where the diameter is the smallest would be in the thoracic region, but again, it's kind of a subtle difference in diameter. Okay, so you can see all of these structures on the big model that I was just holding up. Okay, so now we're going to look at a cross-section through the cord. Do you guys have any questions before we go on? Have all of that. Alrighty, so taking a look at the spinal cord cross-section. And this is kind of just for fun, just FYI. It's just kind of interesting to see how in different levels of the cord, the cross-section will look a little different as far as its shape and the shape of the gray matter, and you don't have to memorize all of that. You don't have to know all those differences. Okay, so this is a cross-section through the cord. Notice, just like in the brain, the white matter and gray matter are separated. Okay, so let's just talk about some of the structures you see here. We know there is a central canal, right? Right in the middle of the gray matter there. What is in the central canal? What does it contain? Just like the ventricles, it contains cerebrospinal fluid. The central canal of the spinal cord is actually continuous with the fourth ventricle. They're connected. So when cerebrospinal fluid is leaving the fourth ventricle, it will go out through the apertures into the subarachnoid space, where it can circulate around the brain and around the cord, but it also, some of it will also go down through the central canal. Okay, so this allows us to have cerebrospinal fluid inside the cord and outside. And the same thing in the brain. We have fluid inside the brain in the ventricles and around the brain in the subarachnoid space. So we have this fluid cushion that's inside and around these structures, and it helps to protect these areas from trauma. Okay, so this is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and it's lined with ependymal cells, just like the ventricles are lined with ependymal cells. Okay, so let's take a look here at these kind of crevices in the cord. Notice that on the anterior side, this is a little bit deeper than on the posterior. So this is called the anterior median fissure, and this is the posterior median sulcus. Okay, this is a fissure, this is a sulcus. Okay, and so taking a look here at the gray matter is in kind of an H or a butterfly shape, and it has these projections that are called horns. Okay, these are called horns. So all the levels of the spinal cord have a posterior horn and an anterior horn. Okay, this is going to be the posterior. You can say dorsal or posterior. This would be anterior or ventral. Either one is fine. Okay, so all the levels of the cord have these. You can think of the posterior horn as being sensory, because this is where sensory information enters the spinal cord. Okay, this is where sensory neurons enter the spinal cord. The anterior horn, you can think of this as being motor, because this is where motor neurons have their cell bodies. Okay. Now notice that they're showing another horn here. They're showing a lateral horn. Okay, the lateral horn is not present at all levels of the cord. It is only present at certain levels where we have autonomic neurons. Okay, so the lateral horn will be for autonomic neurons, and we will talk about those next time. But the posterior and anterior horns are present throughout the length of the cord.
Which ones do have the lateral horn?
Well, it would be the sacral regions of the cord, which would be, the cord is divided up into segments, just like our spinal nerves have numbers. Those segments of the cord have numbers. So those levels would be T1 through T12 of the cord and S2 through S4. So this is where we have autonomic neurons exiting from the spinal cord. So in those parts of the cord. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, I can show you in a diagram. Okay. But for now, you don't have to worry about that. We'll talk about it on Monday or Tuesday. Okay. So those are the parts of the gray matter. Do you guys have any other questions on any of that? Okay, so the white matter is all around the gray. What do you think is going to be traveling through the white matter of the cord? What would you imagine would be there? You guys know white matter is always myelinated axons, right? So would these be commissural or association or projection tracts? Projection, exactly. So we're going to have both ascending and descending projection tracts traveling through these areas of white matter, carrying sensory and motor information to and from the brain. Okay, so these are divided into what are called funiculi. These used to be called columns, and now the terminology is changing. So on your study guide, I still have the term columns there, but notice here they're calling them funiculi. Funiculus is singular, funiculi is plural. So back here, this is called the posterior funiculus. Okay, this is the lateral funiculus, and this is the anterior funiculus. Okay. Can you say column? I don't really care. I don't. I mean, I think that's still fine. Okay, so I used to always cover tracks, projection tracks. I'd like to talk about some of those so you know what kind of information they're carrying and all of that. but we don't really have time, so since we've gone to a shorter semester, which has been for quite a while now, I usually don't get to squeeze those in, so we're not gonna talk about any of those. But I would like you to know that these are, you know, the funiculi of the white matter, and what you would see there would be the projection tracks. So you guys have a bunch of projection tracks that are on your study guide that you can take off the list, okay? And I think you'll see them listed under the spinal cord, and they would be names like spinothalamic, spinocerebellar, there is a fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. Okay, there's a rubrospinal tract, etc. Okay, so all of these you can take off the list. If there's any others right there, cross them out. Okay, we are not going to cover those. If you are curious about these and you want to read about them, they are in chapter 17. And I don't think this is anything that will be a problem for you with physiology. I don't think that you're going to be talking about these in physiology. If you do, then you know they'll review them. They'll review the anatomy with you. I don't think they talk about them a lot, though, if at all. Okay, so notice we have a spinal nerve here. Okay, so we said that the spinal nerves exit from the spinal cord. They go out laterally between the vertebrae, and so that's what you see sticking out here. So let's just talk about the basic structure of a spinal nerve. We'll start this and then we'll finish that on Tuesday, and we'll talk about the autonomic nervous system on Tuesday, and we'll be done. Okay? You guys know your test is next Thursday, right? Okay. So I think this is a good diagram to look at the spinal nerve on because it's kind of not too busy. So notice we have these two parts of the spinal nerve. This is at the actual spinal nerve here, where those two pieces kind of come together. They form the spinal nerve. And then it's going to give off these branches that are going to go to different places. We said that, well, actually we didn't talk about cranial nerves yet, but when we talked about the structure of a nerve, we said that some nerves can be entirely sensory, some are entirely motor, and then some are what we call mixed. Mixed means that the nerve carries both sensory and motor neurons. Okay, carries both sensory and motor neurons. So, you know, the action potentials will be traveling in both directions within that nerve. All of our spinal nerves are mixed. This is the most common type of nerve in the body, and all spinal nerves are mixed. And I'm sorry, I forgot to say one more thing I wanted to say about these. So taking a look again at this diagram, notice that these are named the same way that the vertebrae are. You guys remember how to identify the vertebrae? How many cervical vertebrae did we have? 7, right, so they're named C1 through C7. If you take a look at this, notice we have 8 cervical spinal nerves because the first one exits between the occipital bone and C1. Okay, so that gives us an extra pair. So the spinal nerves are named like this. Okay, there's C1 through C8, and then we have 12 thoracic, so T1 through T12. We have 5 lumbar. And then notice we actually have sacral spinal nerves because the spinal nerves will actually go down into the sacrum and exit through those sacral foramina. So these are identified as S1 through S5. And then we have this one pair of coccygeal spinal nerves that exits between the sacrum and the coccyx, sticking out right here. Okay, so that is abbreviated CO for coccygeal 1. Okay, so one pair of coccygeal spinal nerves. So altogether, this gives us 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Okay, so 31 pairs of spinal nerves. and they are all mixed. Okay, so let's take a look at the basic structure of a spinal nerve. We'll take a look at where the sensory and motor neurons are located, and then we're gonna stop for today. You guys have any questions on that? Right, so remember the green thing is the phylum terminale, it's the piece of pia mater. It helps to hold the cord in place. It kind of gives it a little inferior anchor because it's attached to the coccyx. No, because this is actually not nervous tissue. It's not, like neurons. It's the pia mater. So it's just connective tissue. Yeah, you guys remember how the pia mater is fused to the brain and it's also fused to the cord. So it will extend off the end of the cord and it just travels down to the coccyx. But it has a special name in that area. Instead of just calling it pia mater, it's called the phylum terminale. Okay? Any other questions on any of that? Okay, so let's go back to this. Okay, so we said that the posterior horn is where sensory neurons enter the spinal cord. So let's put a sensory neuron in the diagram and we'll have it coming into the posterior horn. You guys remember that most sensory neurons are what type based on their structure? Remember, you need to know chapter 14. Otherwise, the rest of the nervous system doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? Okay, so you guys want to know your neurons. They are unipolar, right? So the sensory neuron is going to actually have its cell body here. Okay, the axon is going to travel into the posterior horn. So this is a sensory neuron, unipolar sensory neuron. And this little bulge here is where those cell bodies will be located. So what is the structure where neuron cell bodies are located out in the PNS? What do we call that little grouping of neuron cell bodies in the PNS? A ganglion, right? So this is a ganglion. This whole thing here that contains the sensory neurons is called the posterior or dorsal root of the spinal nerve, okay? Posterior or dorsal root of the spinal nerve, this whole thing. Okay? This ganglion that contains the sensory neuron cell bodies is the posterior root ganglion. Okay, and the only thing that's located there are the sensory neuron cell bodies. Okay, so we said that the anterior horn is going to be motor, right? And so this is where we're going to have our motor neuron cell bodies. What type of neuron are motor neurons based on their structure? We only have two left, right? Bipolar or multipolar? Multipolar. So this is where their cell bodies are located, okay, right here in the anterior horn of the gray matter, and the axon is going to travel out, on the anterior root of the spinal nerve, okay? So what travels in the anterior root would be only motor neurons. Okay, so this is the anterior root of the spinal nerve, okay, for motor neurons. The posterior root is only going to be sensory neurons. And again, the cell bodies of those sensory neurons would be in the posterior root ganglion. Does the anterior root have a ganglion? No, because the cell bodies are here. in the anterior horn of the gray matter of the cord, okay? So that is the basic structure of the spinal nerve. When these two roots come together, they kind of fuse together, forming the spinal nerve, then the spinal nerve will contain both sensory and motor neurons. So all of these spinal nerves are mixed, okay? So I think we'll stop here for today. We'll talk about these branches of the spinal nerve next time, and we'll talk about some of the nerves that will go out into, some parts of the body. So we still actually have quite a bit of stuff to cover. I hate to cover a lot of material 2 days before your test, but that's the way it is sometimes, okay? This is just, it's a big organ system. So what you guys wanna do is, if you feel like you're kind of behind, you want to spend a lot of time this weekend catching up. And then I would say, you wanna try to cover some of this. You wanna definitely, study what we've already covered, but I would try to finish this chapter's PowerPoint. If you don't read the book, you don't necessarily have to read the chapter, but go through the PowerPoint and really try to cover at least chapter 16, okay? If you can look over chapter 18's PowerPoint also, that would be great. I mean, you should do that before Tuesday, because you don't wanna really learn new stuff, see it for the first time 2 days before the test. Okay. Okay guys, so for today in lab, you can look at the models. They are out. Spinal cord models are out. This model not only shows the meninges, which we've already talked about, it also shows the parts of the spinal cord. It also shows the parts of the spinal nerve. So everything that we just talked about with the spinal nerve is shown here, okay? These other spinal cord models are very basic, so you're not gonna see as much detail. This doesn't show the meninges. It does show the roots of the spinal nerve. It shows the posterior root ganglion. But other than that, that's about it, okay? Okay, also, you guys are gonna be looking at the sheep brain. Sheep brains will be on the test. Okay, so you have a separate list for the sheep brain. It has the same structures that we've been talking about in the human brain. And so what you're gonna see is a mid-sagittal cut. These are all gonna be cut already. So you don't have to cut it. All you need is, you wanna put on gloves. These are preserved, so they're going to kind of smell like chemicals. And you wanna just put your sheep brain in a tray. Trays are over here. And all you need is just a probe, okay, one of these things, to just point to the different areas, okay? So I will give you a photograph of the sheep brain that you can study from when you're not here, but you definitely wanna take a look at these. It will help you learn the human brain better. And like I said, they will be on the test. I will have a couple of sheep brains out and different areas will be marked, okay? You can look at them today and you can look at them again next time, okay? Don't be afraid. Are you guys going into medicine, nursing? Are you gonna see gross stuff that's smelly? Yes, yes, yes you are, okay? So if you really don't like this, and I don't know, maybe you should think about it.
If we're going to PT, do we get a pass?
What? What?